You're listening to The Interactome, a podcast by a group of young researchers who want to connect you to the world of science by sharing their stories and perspectives. Just in case their bosses are listening, they want to remind you that the opinions expressed here are their own. They also want to remind you not to take anything they say as medical or professional advice, as they are not doctors. Not yet, anyway. Stay tuned about that. And, without further ado, welcome to the Interactome.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Interactome. This is episode 31. We've got a very special guest today. Really excited to introduce him to all of you. But before I do that, I'm going to pass it over to my co-hosts to say a little hello. Just a reminder, this is Natalie. You've heard my voice a few times if you're familiar with the show, and I'll pass it along to Joe.
Hey everyone, Joe here, currently in med school, having a good time with that. Really looking forward to chatting with our wonderful guest today.
And I'm Sam. I do science stuff in the pharmaceutical industry. We'll put it at that. Also possibly heard my voice before. Haven't put on for a second, but I'm also very excited for our guest.
Joe, you saying that you're having fun in medical school? I see a Pinocchio nose, but we won't go into that. Our guest today is Jim Robbins. He is a New York Times bestselling author and science journalist. He is here to talk to us about science communication and science storytelling. Personally, my favorite topic to talk about in the world. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim. Give a little intro and a little bit on your background.
Well, let's see, I wanted to be a fiction writer when I went to college, and I realized that was going to be hard. So I ended up studying journalism. And then not long after I graduated from college in Buffalo, New York, actually just before I graduated, I met my wife, my now wife, and we said, well, let's go out west and look for work and have an adventure. And I'd been out west once, I knew what it was like, but we heard there was work in Texas. We drove to Texas in a 1963 Ford Galaxy, and it was a wild trip. We got to Texas, and it was so hot and muggy, we said, well, let's go north and look for someplace else. We ended up in Montana, and that was 1976. And except for a short stint back east to finish my degree, we've been here ever since. In 1980, through a fluke, I started writing for the New York Times. Met someone who was retiring as a stringer and asked me if I'd like to do it. Not long after that, the managing editor for the New York Times came to Montana, and I met him, and we struck up a relationship. And so I've kind of had this weird career as a freelancer for the New York Times for more than 40 years.
Wow.
But I love every minute of it. And what the New York Times gives you is an entree into other publications and into the book world. And it really helps get into the book business. And I've written 6 books, all critically well received, and I haven't set the world on fire, but they've done pretty well and gotten one of the best reviews I got was for the last book I wrote from the Wall Street Journal. It was on birds, called The Wonder of Birds.
Cool.
Yeah.
Highly recommend that one to all listeners. We know that I am a bird fanatic. If you don't, I've got a bird tattoo on my left arm. It's no joke. I read Jim's book. It's really good. It's kind of formatted almost in and we'll talk about this, but it doesn't read like a nonfiction book. It almost reads like stories and essays, and we'll get into why that's so appealing in science storytelling a little bit further in this episode. But I guess one of my first questions for you, and Jim and I have worked together and known each other for a little while now. When you first became a journalist, why did you decide to pursue maybe science writing as opposed to science research? So a lot of the folks and I'll back up a bit, on the Interactome are researchers by trade. and with the exception of myself, but why were you more drawn to the storytelling aspect?
Well, that's how my brain works. I said I wanted to be a fiction writer. I love stories, and I'm not a scientist, and I don't do that well with science. I mean, I can interpret it, but I really love to tell stories and interpret what's going on in science for lay people. And I think that's a really important role to play, because a lot of science is done off in the corner somewhere. And I think I read somewhere, and I would check, if I was a fact checker, I would say fact check this, but the average scientific paper is read by 6 people. And I don't know if that's true, but it's low. And so a lot of papers that are written never go anywhere. And so I go through and I look for papers that are interesting and mine the information and then talk to the researcher. And if it's important enough, I bring that out and tell the story. And so I think that that's kind of my strength.
And you mentioned that you have written a book on birds, and what are some topics that you primarily find yourself gravitating towards or reporting on, and maybe speak to your storytelling aspect of that a little bit. I imagine that it's easier to kind of storytell with ecology than it is with maybe like chemistry. But I won't, put words in your mouth. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, my specialty, although I'll do anything, if it's interesting enough, my specialty has been the human relationship to the natural world. Why is it important to us? And I think actually the most important question we can ask is, why is there this barrier between humans and the natural world, that we've turned away from it and we're busy watching our phones or computers, playing whatever game on the computer, watching TV? What's happened that we've found the natural world is not as inviting as it should be? And of course, by going out into the natural world, having a relationship with it, that's why we would want to protect it. So, of course, we are destroying much of it now. And so I'm really interested in the, I've written 3 books about the brain and the human nervous system, and why is the human nervous system why does it find the world to be an alien place, largely? So that's one of my specialties. Another specialty is explaining to people what's important about the natural world, and why we should care that biodiversity is being torn down and gobbled up at a record pace, and why species are going extinct. And so that's been my main focus, looking at science and what science tells us about this. Now, there are things outside the realm of science that I'm also interested in. It has to do with our relationship to the natural world. And so I also traffic in those areas as well.
Cool.
And it's such a relevant topic too now, I think, just with climate change and the acceleration, and two, I think one of the things that I find kind of when I'm one that's very kind of passionate about nature and that kind of stuff. A lot of people don't think about biodiversity until it, or climate change until it really impacts them, right?
Yeah.
They're staring it in the face. And I think, but at the same time, it is staring us in the face, right? We have all these bioindicators that are showing us we have a problem. So I'd argue that, your work is extremely, relevant right now.
Well, thanks. So I think maybe we talked about this, that in the bird book, I talk about a study that was done by a woman who studied bluebirds at Cornell. And she wrote a paper about climate change and the human condition and why we deny climate change. And the summation or the reason, the conclusion in her paper was that there's something called terror management theory. And it's the idea that we carry with us this deep fear of dying that comes from infancy and childhood. and Buddhists are, I've interviewed several Buddhists. There's a big Buddhist installation in Montana where they've created this fantastic garden called Garden of 1,000 Buddhas, but it's a sacred technology, they say, and it's to dial down bad karma and dial up good karma because we're coming into a period of increasing bad karma. I don't know if that's true or not, but I did ask them, I said, well, do you guys meditate about death? Because I had heard this story about terror management theory, and there's lots of good research on terror management theory. And they said every day, our job or our personal goal is to imagine different ways we might die and bring up the fear, and then we can dissolve it in our meditation. And it was confirmation that the study about birds the study was written by a woman who studies birds, but it was about climate change. And we deny this global catastrophe, that's the point of the paper, because it reminds us of our own personal catastrophe, which is this extreme fear that we carry with us. And I think that there's a lot to this. I've done my own meditation, and I've done a lot of research in this area. And I think this is perhaps the biggest barrier we face, to not only to reestablish a connection with nature, but to also dial down the craziness out there these days.
Yeah, I feel that. It's I was gonna say I was thinking personally, like, part of the reason people don't engage as much with nature, like, because nature can be quite scary. I think we don't think about that living in our own little bubbles in civilization, but nature can be terrifying. If you're hiking on a mountain, there's always a cliff you could fall off of. There's insects that want to eat you, and there's
grizzly bears out here.
Grizzly bears.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, all kinds of things. And we're so protected from that in our day-to-day lives. And so yeah, that kind of I feel that. I kind of understand that feeling.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say
Definitely.
we're protected from nature. Jim, you're hailing from Montana, so you might be a little more exposed to the grizzly bears than we are here in Boston and Philly.
It's true. A couple days ago, a guy was picking huckleberries and shot a grizzly bear that attacked him, and that's a fairly common story in Montana. Either the bear eats somebody or somebody kills the bear. And I would say we get a story like that once every couple months, maybe once every 6 months. I've done a lot of stories in fact, I got my start in this business writing about grizzly bears.
Why, if you don't mind me asking, why grizzly bears? Was it kind of like a thing that people were concerned about at the time, or was it like
they were highly endangered when I came to Montana?
Yeah,
in the early 1980s. And of course, they're this charismatic, in some ways charismatic, in some ways terrible, terrifying species. There had been something called a Night of the Grizzlies. There'd been an attack, 2 separate attacks in Glacier on one night in the late 60s, killed 2 different parties in the park, separate. And it launched this whole investigation into why these bears would have attacked. And it totally changed management into the 70s. The bears were really low in number. They've quadrupled since then. And the reason they were low in number is because people just threw their trash out, and the bears would come in and go into the trash, and then they'd get shot. The single most important technology that brought bears back from the edge of extinction in the U.S. Were garbage cans that they couldn't get into, and they're still used widely, and a lot of cities are incorporating them as the bear expands out into its territory. But by preventing bears from becoming habituated to human food, it allowed them to be wild and to stay away from people. What would happen is, you'd have a dump. In Yellowstone, they had these giant dumps, and they'd set up bleachers, and people on vacation would go to the dumps, sit on the bleachers, and watch the bears pawing through the trash and eating it. And they stopped that in the 70s. And now we have a wild bear population. That's key to not only to protecting the bear, but also to getting acceptance from people for the bear.
Yeah.
I just think of all those times I read all those signs where it's like, don't feed the ducks bread, like they're gonna just
Yep.
really start to bother everybody. And listeners, you didn't see this, but my jaw dropped at the idea of people setting up on Yellowstone just to watch the bears pick through the trash. That's wild.
No,
Yeah.
times change
Yeah.
for sure.
And
Yeah.
we've got some questions on kind of balancing science and science communication, but what you said about management reminded me of a piece that you wrote recently. So you recently went to California to report on how tribes are managing fires. Maybe you could talk about that experience writing that article a little bit. I think it's a nice gateway into the conversation.
It was quite an interesting adventure. I went to Sequoia National Park, and got a tour with the superintendent. And these trees are the biggest trees in the world, not in terms of height, although they are very tall. But coastal redwoods are a little taller. But in terms of volume, they are the biggest trees by volume. And they've been burning in fires because of fire suppression over the last 100 years or more. A lot of the fires that happen now, they can get up into the branches of these trees. Normally, fires would come through every 5 to 10 years and burn out the low to moderate severity fires would come through and take out the understory, so the fires didn't get into the branches and kill the trees or into the crowns. But 2020 and 2021, these fires came through, lightning caused fires, and just tore through the groves. And there's 75 to 80 groves of sequoias in the world. They're all in California. And the monarch trees are trees that are more than 48 inches in diameter. And these fires killed 20% of the monarchs.
Wow.
And until then, maybe 100 trees had been killed in one season. In these two seasons, each season, thousands of trees were killed. And these trees are 2,000 to 3,000 years old, and they live for a long time. People even thought they were immortal. And what happened? All these trees were dying within a very short period of time. And people got worried. People who saved the Redwoods League and the National Park Service and the Forest Service. So they declared an emergency to start logging underneath the trees, thinning, and to using prescribed fires. But then the tribes came along and said, you should let us also help. We do what are called cultural burns on our land, which is a way of regrowing materials for baskets or for food, things like elderberries, or for wildlife. And so this is being restored. One of my interests, I don't know if you guys have seen this book that's come out recently called The Light Eaters. It's about plants and their intelligence.
No.
A writer from The Atlantic wrote it. Zoe, I'm blanking on her last name. Am I making that up? Am I wrong?
No, I think that's right.
Okay.
And
I
it
have
got
heard
good
of that book.
reviews in the New Yorker and other places. And I think there's some, and they talk about plants as being intelligent. And I think not only is that true, but I think that the tribes, and I've known some of the stories I've done for the last 3 decades or more, the tribes have this emotional relationship with the natural world. I think that the natural world wants this relationship, and I know that people want it. And I think that it's important to kind of create this kind of relationship with the natural world. And that's where some of the science is going. Obviously, this isn't a place where science is going to rush into and try and establish something if it could. I mean, this would be a tough area to study, but I think there's something to it, since the tribes have this tradition of a relationship. I mean, they talk to plants. I know a number of different tribal experts who talk to plants, who talk to wildlife. And I think it's a real thing. And so that's one of the things that drew me to the story.
Really interesting. Yeah. I think one thing that I kind of struggle with as a scientist is taking the experiences, the things I see in the lab, and or like the data that I'm seeing. Obviously, here in this situation, like there's an emotional kind of importance, an emotional connection that tribes and plant life are kind of sharing. But in like kind of in science more broadly, I feel like one thing that a lot of scientists really struggle with is just taking their objective data and connecting it to people's subjective experiences, really like taking it and making it meaningful and relatable and not just numbers. Like, I mean, I studied a protein called Schlafen 12. I thought it was like the most interesting protein ever. But like, who really cares about that? Like, why, like, it's, in your opinion, like, how do you really navigate that kind of like, that so what, that, like, why is this important? And how do you like identify what's most important and share it with people in a way that's meaningful to them? That's something that I'm really struggling with right now.
Well, emotion is important. I know a fellow who wrote for the Times about tax policy for years. And really important stuff, but who wants to sit down with a tax policy story or a book? Well, some people do, obviously, but they have an editor for the books that he writes, whose job is just to go through them and to put emotion into his books. I look for ways to kind of shoehorn in emotional events and emotional things, experiences. So emotion is really important. So I wrote a book about trees called The Man Who Planted Trees. And and trees are different because they're important, but still you're reading about a tree and they can be important. But what the story is the story of a guy who had a near-death experience and was told that he should, told on the other side by spirits that he should clone the largest tree of every species to protect those species when climate change comes in, when climate change gets worse. And so I did a story. I didn't know this at the time. I did a piece for the Times. He and his son were collecting these cuttings from all these different champions. And so there's a book in Washington, D.C., and the national champion of every species is kept in this book. And he and his son will go around and take cuttings from these trees and then grow copies of these trees in a lab. They're still doing it. And then plant them in living libraries, whether it's a national cemetery or an arboretum or something. And I did a piece for the Times on these living libraries they were creating. Well, then David, the guy who was doing this, came to Helena to visit me after I'd written the story, and he told me that he'd had this near-death experience, and that's why he was doing it. And so you have this story of a guy who was an alcoholic, kind of a ne'er-do-well, and then he died and came back and had this mission from light beings. It's pretty far out, but it told a real scientific story. And so you have this built-in narrative to kind of tell a story about science, climate change, trees, increased mortality of trees, and so on. And it appealed to me. And so that was the book that I proposed. And actually, my editor was very interested in it. But it's a vehicle for telling a story about science. And there may be that you're talking about this protein. I mean, it might be something similar or not. But if you can find, something to kind of relate that people can relate to, and the story itself might not be much about the protein at all. It might be about a guy who found the protein, discovered it, and it changed his life somehow. But the important thing is you're telling a story that connects to people and to their experiences, and just the data alone isn't enough to kind of make a story interesting often.
Absolutely.
It's a real talent to be able to take something like that and make it into something that's readable and approachable for a lot of people.
Yeah. Just to reiterate, to make sure like I am hearing what you're saying, because I think I'm learning a lot through our conversation here. Like the essentially, just to reiterate, you're kind of taking, like, sure, your science may be important, but if you don't have a kind of a more personal thing to share, a more personal like line to the story that can connect with a broad audience, it's not going to touch people's hearts.
Well, they might not even be interested in, but if you tell them that, I first, like, say you had a lead in the story that said, I first found out about protein, something or other, when my first child was born. And then you talk about, I don't even know what this protein is, but talk about, something about proteins in humans and so on, and the role they play. But you have to really bring those elements out. And the stuff about the protein might not even figure that largely into the story. But I'm working with a writer in Kosovo now. She's from here, but she's there. And she wrote this proposal for a story in Smithsonian about this bobcat that's endangered in Kosovo. And I said, don't give me the facts, give me the story. And that's the important thing, is you want the story first, and you build the story, and then the facts kind of fit into the story. And that's your vehicle for getting your information across.
I tested this out myself a little bit when I was in undergrad. Because I'm a masochist, I decided that I was going to try to teach high schoolers science, like in hour-long classes. And I was going to try to keep them from falling asleep. Didn't always work, but I always was like, okay, I need to find like the most out there, over the top thing. And so I would do things like, I taught a class about like international espionage and assassinations and stuff to try to teach kids about analytical chemistry, or it's like I was trying to like sneak things in and try to make it so that like this subject that's really dense and really hard to grasp was wrapped up in something that would, excite a teenager's like interests, so it's like, it wasn't, at the end of the day, I was like, I want to teach this. Now, what's something interesting I can tack onto that? And it was always a challenge, but I tend to find that science that can be deadly and dramatic and stuff like that is a great way to get like a teenager to read it, or to look at it, I should say. That's how I got into science. Even was the thing that got me into biochemistry was I was taking an intro bio class in high school, and they started talking about cyanide and the way that cyanide acts. The way that's because
classic.
This is like a very typical science lesson when you're doing teaching biochemistry. Because you talk about respiration, you talk about ATP, you talk about glucose and all these things that are very straightforward, and then at the very end of it they'll say, well, there's this whole giant process, but you need oxygen because it needs to like take electrons and the whole thing, and cyanide just goes in there, and that's the whole reason why cyanide is deadly, is it fits where oxygen fits. And it was like this really elegant story about something that, like, it's like you think about like the spy movies with the cyanide pills and everything, these dramatic stories. And that's what got me into science to begin with. Like, I thought I wanted to be an engineer, or I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to design these things, and ultimately I kind of came back to that in my career. But what got me into biochemistry was this really dramatic, deadly thing.
I did not know that.
Yeah, because as a kid I was like, wait, it's that simple? Like, that's why this thing, that's why there's this deadly thing out there, is because it just fits in a little spot that something else fits. And that got me into biochemistry. That's, I've sat through Orgo and PChem and all those things because someone explained to me how cyanide works. So I totally feel that. That's, I think we're all emotional people.
Right. And so if you're going to write about cyanide, you wouldn't write about things you just talked about. You would start out with a story about somebody killing somebody, and then you can kind of back into the science. But the first, when you write a magazine story, and that principle that carries over into books and so on, is the hook. And the first paragraph, or the lead of the story, the first 6 or 7 paragraphs, is the hook, and that's what brings people into a story. And then you can kind of, tell them a little more about about what you're going to talk about and so on, but you can never forget that you're telling a story and kind of just lose yourself in the data and the information, because that's just a formula for a story that no one's going to read. So, or very few people are going to read.
So
And as you go through and you read things in magazines and newspapers and online, you start to see, you would apply this filter. Here's a story that's about science. How did the writer handle it? And you can kind of interpret it for yourself to learn more about how to communicate science to people, to your friends as well.
Yeah.
So on average, if you focus on the data, 6 people will read it.
Yeah,
Is that
if that's true, yes.
If that's true.
Yeah.
I haven't been on papers myself. The successful ones, I feel like I don't think they push 1,000 reads all that often, but so 6 sounds about right. It sounds that doesn't sound too far off, especially because there's a lot of small papers out there. There's also, frankly, a lot of papers that aren't good, even as from a scientific perspective. And every scientist will have a list of things that are in a bad paper and why only 3 papers ever are good, 2 of which are theirs. But it's like
it's important to say that I'm not denigrating scientific
Yeah,
research.
no.
I'm just saying, I mine them for ideas, but it's just a whole different form. I did a story. It's pinned on my Twitter page. It's a story about the bird that flies the longest migration in the world and how they do it. And the story is partly about the bird, but it's about this researcher who goes into Alaska and traps these birds and what he does to get there and what I had to do to go with him. But when I proposed the story on aeroecology that I'm writing now for Smithsonian, the first thing my editor says, do you have a researcher just like the one in the other story who runs the marathons? I mean, he's studying a bird that flies the longest migration. This is what editors want. This is the juice for a magazine story. Is something like, at least some magazine stories. And the bird stuff is interesting, but it would be overwhelming if you just focused on bird physiology or migration or biodiversity loss.
To be clear, I was not insinuating that you were denigrating scientists. I left academia.
I get it.
I left academia in a messy fashion, and maybe I have a couple of my own emotional relationships with that. So maybe you were hearing those.
Hey, as someone still in academia, I denigrate the scientific process sometimes myself. And I think it's like that kind of humor is useful for pointing out how it can improve, for sure.
And one thing too, I think, and this kind of goes into our, Joe, I know you have a question on this. So much of science and scientific research is looking to the answer to a question, right? Your hypothesis. But a lot of the times that just leads to more questions or more things that have been uncovered or other holes. So how do you, Jim, navigate maybe the unknown of science in your work? I can imagine that a lot of the times when you're writing a story, and you're focusing on the story and there are aspects of science in it and you're telling that kind of I don't know if saying secondary is the right way to say it, but you're telling a story and you're communicating science. How do you navigate these kinds of missing pieces in your work? And Joe and Sam, as past researchers and current researchers, would love to hear those thoughts as well.
Totally.
Well, I always try, if they're important things like trees, you're writing about trees or you're writing about birds, I try to point out the fact that here's a really important area and we almost nothing. I wrote a piece for the Times, and you can find this online, and it's about again, it's about the same bird, the godwit Hudson. This was about bar-tailed godwits. They're similar in how far they fly, but they go for 8 days, and they power flight. It's powered flight. It's not gliding. It's not soaring, dynamic soaring. It's powered flight for 8 or 9 days, night and day.
Nonstop, 8 or 9 days.
Yes.
It's a long
Wow.
time.
And the bar-tailed godwit flies from southern Alaska to New Zealand. And it does this over open ocean all the way. How do they find their way? How do they live? How do you sleep? And a lot of questions. Well, one of the ways they sleep is perhaps through something called unihemispheric sleep, which is sleeping on one side while you're flying and then opening that side and sleeping on the other side. Animals do this. And then, how do they find their way? Nobody knows. Where do the calories come from? Well, they double their weight from 1 pound to 2 pounds before they leave. And that's part of it, but they're spending so many more calories than anyone thought they were in this period that the whole model for the energy of flying had to be rewritten, and they still don't know how the bird does this. And so I wrote a story about the bar-tailed godwit and how little they know about this bird's migration and their physiology of it. And young bar-tailed godwits, they believe, leave Alaska without any adult help and find their way to New Zealand. And no one knows how they do it. So whenever I'm doing a story on the bar-tailed godwit or something, another species, I write about the things that they know. But I love stories in which we can say, we have no idea how these birds do this. And so I kind of focus on that. One of the books I want to write, the next one I hope, is on how little we know about the world. And one area is something called viral ecology. And very few people know this, that viruses, 800 million viruses are falling on every square meter of the planet every day. And a lot of these viruses contain DNA that are incorporated into plants, into animals, into humans, and they're critical for disease resistance and so on. The human cardiopulmonary system is based on ancient virus DNA that was incorporated into the human genome, hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Wow.
It's called. And so there's a whole world of mystery out there. And this is one of the ways that I think it's important to tell people that, we have no idea about this world that we live in, and kind of encourage a sense of wonder about things that are going on out there and we might be interested in, and kind of see if you can pull people away from their phones or their iPads. Or I've done some reporting on, I can't think of the term for the technology. Oh yeah, the immersive technology they use for pain control. Meta, Facebook is using it now, and it totally surrounds your ability to you engage only with the virtual world. You don't engage with the real world at all. And they use it for pain control in burn victims. And it works better than opioids for pain control. But that tells you something about attention. And then here's another thing we know very little about, is the human attention system. I've written 3 books about attention, and it's extraordinarily powerful. It's the basis for meditation. It's the basis for a lot of things. We do it every day, all the time, yet we don't think about it. And so I would like to write a book about the importance of the human attention system. A number of pieces and books have been written. New Yorker just did a big piece on attention, but they missed the boat on it. But it's super powerful and super important we understand this, because it can change lives. It can dissolve pain, emotional and physical pain. I mean, again, in meditation uses different types of attention all the time for these things. And we all could learn to do it, but instead we just spray our attention in a lot of different ways, kind of indiscriminately, and don't realize how important it is. So I guess the upshot for all of this is that there's really important things out there that we know very little about.
Yeah. I think for me, one thing that's been challenging as a scientist, trying to explain like what I do to like friends or family, things like that, is I think like obviously I think I do this outside of my own work, like as well. But like when I'm focused on my own work, I tend to think in probabilities, and I tend to think in like percentages, or like the amount of chance that something may be true. And then like when translating that to like explain it to someone who's not in my field, I often find myself struggling with the fact that like people outside the field prefer to have certainty about like some kind of topic. Like, is it actually this? Is it not? Things like that. And that's kind of a tension that's challenging to work with. And I also certainly like end up like I catch myself expecting it from people that do other kinds of work that I'm not involved in as well.
Oh.
And so like I think that's definitely, it seems like a challenge when communicating like data-based information that is oftentimes based on probabilities or chance or like studies that show that this may be a thing. But I think the thing I'm taking away from your what you're sharing here is that like sometimes you don't necessarily have to condense things into like a yes or no answer. Sometimes just pointing out the like sort of what is in like the fact that we don't know, like that can actually be very interesting. And like I think that's
especially if it's really important.
Yeah.
And then you can make informed speculation about what these things might mean based on what the scientist says or based on what other similar things are, what role is played by other similar things, or one of the things that I just talked about was the emotional relationship between the natural world and humans.
Yeah.
And but you could look in literature. There was a guy named Wade Davis who was a National Geographic explorer, anthropologist, and he wrote a book called The Wayfinders. And it was all about the ethnosphere. The ethnosphere, there's 7,000 indigenous cultures around the world or so. And they've all adapted to the place that they live. They have their relationship over thousands of years with natural systems, with birds, especially birds and wildlife and plants. And so he has this wonderful definition about this ethnosphere that talks about it's all the hopes and dreams and imagination of humans for thousands of years around the world. And it's rich in information, rich in stories. And, we're starting to do some of that now, but we don't do much with all that. We could really do with systemic reviews and so on. One of the things I talk about in the bird book that comes from the ethnosphere, I talked to an ethnobotanist, ornithologist, a woman, very free thinker, and she's done a lot of work with 3 or 4 different tribes. She says the humans in the hunter-gatherer cultures that she studied have this ability to project their consciousness outside of their body to sense the world, other people, to sense the world in trees or wildlife and so on. And she said it's very common in hunter-gatherer societies, and it's very important to know your environment well, and they don't even think about it, but of course we would, because we don't experience that kind of a thing. Is this true? Well, I think it could be, and I think it's really important to understand it. If I have the ability to sense the world in a very different way, a more sensitive way, I would like to know more about that. So these are the kind of things I think are important that I've picked up here and there and come from the ethnosphere or wherever, in meditation perhaps. And I think we're missing the boat on a lot of this stuff. And I think that, so that's one of the things I try to write about, one of the unknowns out there,
Well, would you say it's kind of like a like instead of looking at the natural world from an objective standpoint, like maybe more like subjectifying with it? Okay.
Yeah. I think that's important, One of the things I learned about attention, writing these books with this expert in attention, is that objective is only one way of paying attention to the world. And he says we're locked into what he calls a narrow objective focus, which we see a small, it's hard to tell, but I'll give you an example in a minute. So we see a small, almost aperture, we see the world through a small aperture that keeps us removed from the world. And if you can move out of this narrow objective focus that he talks about into a broader, more immersive way of paying attention, it's a totally different place to live.
Yeah.
And his whole ability, his whole message, he died a couple of years ago, but his whole message was, we need attentional flexibility. We need to be able to move into narrow objective focus, but we also need to move into other different styles of attention, more immersive, more diffuse, or whatever, to fully experience the world. And I think there's something to this. Again, it's not part of our science really, but it's really important. I sat with him. It was when I first learned about this. He had an office in New Jersey. He and his wife treated people with this approach. And I sat in his office, and he showed, there's a painting by Andrew Wyeth called Christina's World. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a woman out on the grass, and it's quite famous. You probably have seen it, don't remember it, but she's out on a lawn, and there's a building there and a house. Yeah, and so he showed slides of this and of this painting. And the first thing you do is you look at the house and the shed, and you look at the woman on the grass. And then he says, close your eyes. And he does this exercise where he has me imagine space. That's another whole thing. But space, being aware of space is critical to being able to manage your own nervous system. So he had me close my eyes, and in 15 minutes or so, he had me imagine space between myself and the wall, and around me, and beyond the wall, and above me, and so on. And when I opened my eyes, I suddenly saw the whole painting as one, rather than seeing the different disparate elements of the painting. And so the book is called Open Focus. So it opened my focus, the aperture of my attention, into a much broader way in just 15 minutes. And so that's kind of the core. And then once you learn to open your focus through these exercises he has, you've also learned to then start allowing pain that we've all resisted feeling in our bodies, and allowing our bodies to fully feel. That's the key part of it. And then he gives you tools to dissolve emotional and physical pain using attention. And it's very powerful. I used it for years, and really important. And that's one of the things I plan to follow up on with a book, or certainly with some essays. And I've been working on it. So a little harder to get that stuff published because it's a little bit more, less grounded in science, and it's more of a therapeutic approach than it is a scientific approach. But people are looking for these kind of things these days. I see a lot about how can I kind of transcend my life, whether it's hallucinogenics or ketamine or whatever. I mean, what's the stuff they're using in South America? People go on trips to
Ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca.
Right?
Yeah. I know a guy.
I don't know how I knew that off the top of my head.
That was a wild thing.
But I knew that so fast.
Michael Pollan wrote about these things. So when I was young, this was counterculture stuff. Now it's part of mainstream culture. People are looking for answers, and they know there's something more out there. So and there is. I will tell you that there is.
I was going to say about embracing uncertainty. Joe, you were mentioning speaking to non-scientists about probability, and you're saying, these things are unscientific, but I think, or they seem unscientific, but I think one thing that I found, coming from a place where I was, getting really enmeshed in all this research stuff and trying to dig into these unknowns and getting frustrated with it, people at work will ask me questions like, what will happen if I do this? And I'm like, I don't know. This system is too complicated. These things, and they're like, well, how could I know? I'm like, well, do you want to spend, 10 years and get a few $1 million grants? You could figure it out, or you could go into the lab and just do it, because at the end of the day, we're working with stuff that's physical and you can just test it. And I think that, that being objective mentality, even in science, can sometimes get you lost in questions that are just completely unimportant. Like the big picture is ultimately, what you're trying to do. And it's just wild to me, because people will be like, well, what do you think will happen? I'm like, well, these things could happen. This is a kind of probability space you're working in, but also we're working with something that's so hard to understand that you're not going to get a satisfying answer to that in an objective sense. I spent a long time seeking that, and finally kind of gave up on it. And it's funny to now I'm more of an engineer, and I think that it's funny that I gave up on the objective answers as much. It's like, what do you mean you're an engineer? You gave up on the answer. Well, it's like, well, no, that at the end of the day, now I'm motivated by what is there and what is present, and it's a shift. So that's absolutely right. Even in science, I think that that's essential.
And I think the important thing too about navigating, the unknown means you keep asking questions, right? You look back on the history of science and like they used to think that, the sun orbited Earth, right? Like it's things like that where you have to keep asking questions because science will or could eventually be wrong. We might be looking at things a completely different way. And if we don't ask those questions, we're never going to know. We're never going to get there. So
Science is limited to those things that can get funded. Science
Hmm.
is limited to often to things that are going to make somebody money, just lightning just flashed outside. So there's and then science is also doesn't like to ask questions that they think might challenge the status quo, might challenge the main paradigm. A lot of science doesn't.
Sam, that looks like it hits home for you.
There's
you
just
know, writing about intelligence of plants, for
yeah.
example. People roll their eyes, scientists roll their eyes and say, oh, it's just silly, plants are not conscious and so on. But there's a whole tradition of not only plants, but the earth as being conscious. In fact, most of human history, we saw a lot of the world that way. And there's a movement, not a movement, but there's a branch of study called panpsychism. And one of the top experts who works for the Paul Allen Institute, Neurology Institute in Seattle, his name is Christoph Koch, says that he thinks that panpsychism, that the world is minded, everything in the world, not just people or plants, but everything, even things like landforms and so on, is the most elegant and parsimonious explanation for the world. And so a lot of these things that are important are considered far out, but they're not as far out as you might think. And I think we're finding out right now that a lot of these things are really important, and people are kind of overcoming a lot of those traditional barriers about what science considers important and what's really important. So, and I see that in this plant work. I've read a lot. When I wrote the tree book, I read a lot and talked to a lot of people about the intelligence of plants. And I see those, the New York Times wrote a piece about it, which they never would have done 20 or 30 years ago, but it's starting to break into the mainstream. A lot of these things are starting to break into the mainstream, and I think it's important. Barriers are falling.
Oh,
I
no,
feel
go
like I
ahead.
should address the face I was making, which is just, that I think there's this idea of not wanting to upset the paradigm, but often what I've seen in science is there are often like two paradigms that are often, and they're usually like tiny little things. It's not something like, oh, like these like bigger picture stuff. Scientists will get entrenched in these little things, and it's hard because I'm looking at these sorts of things from like a semi-expert point of view, being like, why are you two arguing about this? Like, we don't know the answer to this question. And furthermore, like the answer is probably somewhere in between or something entirely different. You see this a lot. Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease researchers, there was actually a drug approved recently that there was, to say that people got upset would be understatement of the century. And it's just these two entrenched groups that are really, they have their theories, and if one person goes so far as to make a drug that supports one of these hypotheses, they minced no words. It was interesting to watch. And like, and then you say that, and then you're going to go so far as to say these big dramatic things about the world and things that are not really objective. And the idea of being non-objective to a scientist is so shocking, but then you see where objectivity gets you in these little tiny boxes. So
I think one thing that I'm kind of taking away from all of this, like sort of just thinking about, at least to me philosophically, like what makes a good story, is kind of just like it seems like obviously just sharing your objective data as a scientist is not really the best thing, the most helpful, the most impactful, but combining both, like thinking about balancing both the objective and the subjective at multiple different scales, maybe like thinking both about the deep and narrow and also taking things broader and going beyond purely subjective information to look at a larger picture. Like to me, it seems like a lot of that and balancing all of that in just the right way is what makes a compelling story. I don't know if you guys have any changes to that thesis, but that's something I'm picking up here for sure.
One of the things, just thinking about your statement about, what was the name of the protein you were talking about?
Schlafen 12. It means to sleep in German, and it was like the 12th one that they found. And there are like a bunch of different ones that are similar to it. So yeah.
And what does it mean in German?
To sleep. Specifically, the reason that it was named that was because when they took the protein and expressed it at high amounts in a cell, it would lead the cell to quiesce, to stop proliferating and replicating. It would just like kind of freeze in place and quote, go to sleep. So I think the people who discovered it were German, hence Schlafen, instead of sleep 12 in English or dormir 12 in Spanish or whatever.
And so you just kind of thrown this off the top of my head to write a story about Schlausen 12 is to say, what's a protein? What does it do for me? To build some context into the story.
Totally.
Because you're not going to be able to write a story about Schlausen 12 without providing context. And the context will be where it gets interesting, because then you have this explanation to make toward the, or in the body of the story, because I know basically what proteins are, but even as a science writer, I know they're critical, but I don't know much about what they do and so on. And so you could build a nice little story that kind of builds some context for you to explain why this is important. And it's using your imagination to kind of cast out there in the world for things that are interesting that would fit into the body of the story. And that actually takes experience, but something to think about.
Totally. Maybe I'll write a story about it going forward. Yeah. How do you, like, in the context of these really challenging situations and the sense of like that we're missing the right questions or like really kind of like forgetting to ask these important things and facing really challenging situations as a result, like how do you, like, is there any way that you kind of like maintain your sort of like optimism and motivation to stay focused on these sort of things? Is there anything that you kind of think about that kind of gives you hope?
Well, yes. I mean, first off, I would say part of it's just your physiology, my physiology. There's a saying, I'm an intellectual pessimist, but a glandular optimist. And my optimism is glandular. I think that that's how I am as a person. But I also see, especially people in your generation, I see a lot of people reacting to the stuff going on in the world and pulling in the right direction. Do things about climate change and do things about racism or whatever it is in the world. There's a lot of movement in that direction, and that gives me hope and to understand biodiversity and to do science about it. I just think we need to expand the questions we ask and move on from just kind of studying, the habits of certain species to understanding more about the totality of the place that they live, and use more of our imagination that way. So, I see a lot of people doing a lot of good things. My own kids are doing good things, and really, I think it's really important. And so, that gives me hope.
Yeah. Mentoring folks. I've seen the same thing, mentoring folks. I've got an intern at work and she's asking amazing questions. Well, not personally my intern, but she's asking amazing questions about things like climate change and things like waste. And I'm like, okay, it's like every time I interact with folks, even just a little younger than me, and obviously I'm a young person, relatively young person myself, it's like there's this feeling of like, the kids are all right. It's like it's
that's right. They give you hope. But the most important thing we can do, and that's what I hope this book that I am kind of been noodling around with for a long time is expansion of human consciousness. to think about more than just the data, to put it in these terms, and to think more about the totality of your own mind and body and the data and the world we live in. I think that's making those connections is going to be really important. And we need to, I interviewed this guy who was an elder. And he is a Zia elder. And the Zias are a Pueblo tribe in outside of Albuquerque. And they're famous for their pottery and has a bird motif. I mean, almost everything they do has a bird motif, and it's considered sacred. So I said to him, I said, why is the bird motif on everything? And he said, he thought for a minute, and he said, because birds see the big picture. And he said, that's sacred in our beliefs. And I think that's really important. We don't see the big picture as a culture. And I think so that any way I can kind of, in my writing, or anyone can do, is kind of tweak people to kind of, and the bird book does that. I've had good feedback about it. It helps us to think in a bigger way about the world and our place in it.
Yeah.
Well, where can people learn more about your books? I found, your books on Goodreads, but, any resources you want to point the lovely Interactome listeners to?
Well, I would first say go to your independent bookstore and order from there. But if you have to go to Amazon, well, don't let that stop you. They're there. There's good reviews there. And read the stuff I've done in the Times. That's kind of where most of my writing is there. And E360 is published by Yale University. And I get into some of these things, although I have to say I've done a lot of this work for 40 years, this kind of journalism. And I have yet to knit it all together into kind of a masterwork about why it's important. I mean, it's important on its face, whether it's grizzly bears or whatever. But I have this something coming that's going to kind of talk about the role all of these things, how they fit together. There's one thing I want to mention. There's a guy named David Abram. I forget the name of the essay, but it's really important. He talks about perception, and he has something to do with a Gaia hypothesis or something. If you can find it, that would be great.
It The Spell of the Sensuous?
Yeah, The Spell. That's his book, but there was an essay he wrote before that.
The Ecology of Perception?
Yeah, The Ecology of Perception. And what it's about how important our perception of the world is to our place in it. And his point is that perception has been studied mostly in the lab, and it hasn't been studied in the natural world. And he believes that, and this gets back to some of the things I'm talking about with the tribes, he believes that perception in nature is participatory, that there are signals that we can take in, and we also provide to nature that's really important that we've lost sight of. And that's what I was getting at when I talked about the hunter-gatherers and their ability to cast their perception into the world. I think this is really an important area. I think this is a game changer if we can figure out and talk more about the importance of changing our ability to perceive the world. I think that's half of my career has been about that, and I think it's really it plays a big role. But read that essay he wrote. It's gotten a lot of awards, and he's like a chair studying. I think he's in New Mexico now, but he was appointed to a chair in Norway, and it really struck home with a lot of people.
Really cool. Looking forward to reading it and to maybe reading your eventual book.
Yes, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming on the show. I can speak personally. I took a lot from this conversation. I found Jim on Twitter. He's also a little active on there. So at Jim Robbins 19. Feel free to. I'm just plugging your social without asking permission. I hope that's fine. But you post a lot of your stories on there. And then as for Interactome, we are at Interactome_media. On Instagram and at the Interactome on Twitter. So we'll see you guys there. Thanks for listening.
All right, you guys, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.